I'd like to begin by paying tribute to Robert Irwin, a man who broke the mould of what Islamic studies scholars should look like and behave like. He was a man who made many contributions to Islamic art. They were often original, even more often quirky, unpredictable, and always insightful. And I always think of him as the one that got away in our field because he made so many contributions to it. Right, let's go. Edinburgh University Library possesses the largest surviving fragment in Arabic of the first version of the world history of Rashid. The entire text, of which this fragment is perhaps 12%, was by far the most comprehensive global history ever attempted anywhere on the planet in medieval times. Datable to 1314, probably executed in Tabriz, the Ilkhanid Mongol capital, the 150 folios of the Edinburgh fragment contain, among much else, a cycle of 10 images, the fullest of the earliest attempts by Islamic painters to present the biography of the Prophet Muhammad pictorially. My paper will tackle two themes. The first deals with the problems which this project brought in its train. The second explores how the spiritual aspects of Muhammad's life are presented pictorially in this fragment. First then, the problems. The painters faced a difficult task, for there were no ready-made Islamic models to hand, not even Islamic paintings that could, by tweaking, serve new religious purposes. The huge size of the manuscript, 45 by 34 centimeters, something like that, presented a further challenge, for this alone removed the option of making the pictures tiny images that would have been easily overlooked. Moreover, some 6 centuries of systematic aniconic decoration in Islamic religious contexts had passed. The spectre of a long-held taboo would have lurked at the back of the painter if he were a practicing Muslim. Moreover, this was not a private manuscript for a private patron, but as public as the technology of the time, devoid as it was of newspapers, radio, TV, social media and their related devices, could be. The choice of subject matter in the 10 images that constitute this cycle was not simple. The relevant text, folios 42 to 57, covers only the early life of the Prophet up to the Hijrah. Perhaps there was much more, since half the manuscript, 150 folios, was stolen. No date, no thief, known by name. Although folios 42 to 57 do contain numerous episodes that might have triggered powerful images, I started looking thoroughly at the text and found more than 20. The painters ignored them, and 6 out of the 10 episodes in this cycle either transmit no sense of spirituality at all, or in one case, only marginally so. And since this is the longest of several early cycles of Muhammad's life, one should expect to encounter images that prove to be dead ends, which most later cycles of the Prophet's life ignore. And I'll show you them now. the finding of the Zemzem well, the negus of the Abyssinians protecting Muslim asylum seekers, the torture of early Muslim converts, the Quraysh in whispering conclave, and, as you've seen, Muhammad carrying the black stone. And finally, Muhammad with Abu Bakr and a herdswoman. Clearly, this sequence of images does not cohere into a single message. The whole is not yet something more than its parts. After all, successful religious iconography doesn't fall like ripe fruit into the hands of the painter without effort. Perhaps then the illustration of the Prophet's life was a process. A serious dilemma faced the painters who first attempted to narrate the Prophet's life via pictures, not words. A very different task. It was no easy matter to transform the story into images, to fashion a distinctively Islamic religious iconography from scratch. One has only to remember that it took Christian artists half a millennium to develop a Christian iconography that worked, and the way to that success was strewn with trial and error, teething troubles, dead ends, false starts, and other obstacles. So how could Ilkhanid painters succeed at the first attempt to create a coherent pictorial cycle of images covering the Prophet's early life? It's no accident that other cycles, whether broadly contemporary or much later, reflect very different emphases. Those cycles illustrate a remarkable variety of texts, including an account of the Prophet's Miraj, or ascension to heaven, the history of At-Tabari, and the calendrical work of Al-Biruni. So the images of the Prophet in the Edinburgh fragment of the world history are not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a vibrant contemporary fashion around 1300 in Mongol Iran. There is very little overlap between the Edinburgh paintings and those of the other early cycles of Muhammad's life, and that speaks of a theme in flux. The Ilkhanid painters were therefore thrown upon their own meagre resources to devise appropriate images, no matter whether they chose the subject matter themselves or had it plonked on them. True, they had a free hand, in theory, and could allow their imaginations ample play. But the range of Muhammad-related subject matter in this text is very wide indeed, and it transmits various messages. Sometimes Muhammad's spiritual associations, supernatural associations, are underlined, sometimes not, and often he is not even depicted. Hence the somewhat uncertain focus in the cycle as a whole. In short, for good or ill, these painters were forced either to invent appropriate images from scratch, a very tall order, or to copy and adapt possible models taken from sources that had nothing at all to do with Muhammad. And that brings me to my second theme, namely how the images express spiritual content. Ideally, this would involve analysing such issues as consistency of approach, choice of episodes, obvious omissions, errors, weaknesses and dead ends. the compositional devices employed, how well the images cohere into a cycle, and the relationship between these and other contemporary images of Muhammad. Time's too short to do more than mentioning these themes. The most striking fact to bear in mind is that for 3 of the 4 images that carry a spiritual resonance, the painters chose to borrow from a Byzantine source. Mongol tolerance of other religions would have given the painters of the world history daily, easy access to Christian images that they could have seen carried aloft in processions, on the walls of churches, or in books. Byzantium, then, is the elephant in the room. Despite the theological imprecations against Christian doctrines like the Trinity and the Incarnation that were a standby of Muslim theology, these Islamic painters did not scruple to borrow lavishly from Christian iconography when devising illustrations of episodes in the Prophet's life, and to rework or otherwise adapt what they borrowed. Sometimes the Byzantine original is readily recognizable. On other occasions, it can only be sensed darkly behind a veil. Moreover, Muslims are well aware that Muhammad repeatedly asserted that he himself was a mere man. This may explain the lack of a halo in any of the scenes depicting the Prophet, although earlier in this very manuscript, Moses is depicted with a rayed halo as he calls down destruction on the drowning Egyptians. But these painters were very successful in finding other ways to present Muhammad as something more than a mere mortal. For example, he's shown 4 times in the company of 1 or 2 angels. Now, the first image, with a marked Byzantine ancestry, depicts the birth of Muhammad. The formula followed here is unmistakably Byzantine in its elements, though these are squeezed into a tripartite architectural formula rather than being allowed to interact naturally in free space. Gone are the shepherds and the 3 kings. Gone too are the animals that attend the birth of Christ in Byzantine iconography. They are replaced by a solicitous quintet of women who care for the prostrate mother, and, this is the most momentous change, 2 angels, one carrying an incense burner and the other holding the baby. Joseph, who is demoted to the part of a bit onlooker, you have trouble recognizing him. There he is. In Byzantine art, is replaced by Abdul Muttalib, Muhammad's grandfather, who was to act as Muhammad's guardian as he grew up. The looped curtain and porphyry columns lend an authentically Byzantine flavour to the scene. All this imparts a portentous spiritual and supernatural character to the scene. This is no ordinary birth. It's worth noting that the accompanying text mentions none of the elements in this image. It's all the painter's doing. It merely notes that the Prophet was born. The very next painting supports and reinforces this sense of otherworldliness. It depicts the moment of truth when Muhammad, who was accompanying a group of Arabian merchants in a menial capacity as they traveled to Syria, is recognized as a prophet by a Christian anchorite, Bahira, who surveys the scene from the high tower of his hermitage. Bahira has previously assured the merchants that among them lurks a prophet, but as they present themselves before him, one by one, he rejects them each in turn, finally demanding whether there's anyone else travelling with them. The moment he sees Muhammad, he identifies him as the chosen one. His impetuous outflung arm, with its pointing hand emerging from the ruffled sleeve, is echoed by the dramatically jagged fall of drapery below. Following Byzantine convention, he is ascended by a disciple who serves as a witness to this theophany. In other words, a miracle is not a miracle without a witness. The rest of the image consists of an utterly extraordinary coup de théâtre. Much of the central space is taken up not by people, but by a trio of kneeling camels in echelon with their baggage stacked above them. They seem to genuflect with bowed heads in worship before the group to the left, which comprises the merchants divided into two groups, with the diminutive figure of the Prophet Muhammad as a boy standing meekly in the centre with folded hands and silhouetted against empty space. The oldest merchant, identified as such by his white beard, inclines his head as a gesture of respect. Above the boy, heaven, in the shape of a blue semicircle, opens to reveal a figure, clearly an angel, leaning down, unsupported, scroll in one hand and bottle in the other, to anoint Muhammad, who alone is clad in a robe checkered in blue, white and red. His hair hangs in long plaits on either side of his face, a distinctively Arab idiom. The self-contained scene that we're looking at is a boldly original riff on the familiar Byzantine iconography of Jesus being baptized in the center of empty space, depicted frontally with angels grouped on either side of him. In contrast to the preceding nativity scene, this image doesn't copy, but takes a well-worn Byzantine religious image of totally different content and meaning, and audaciously reworks it to totally unexpected effect. Once again, the main elements in this image do not correspond to the text, which describes Bahira seeing a tree whose leaves move to give the prophet shade, and tells how the monk took the boy aside to interrogate him and, I quote, saw the seal of prophecy between his shoulders. The third image to be discussed radiates spiritual power to an exceptional degree. It also follows the accompanying text closely. This image marks the moment when Muhammad, following his regular custom to go to Mount Hira outside Mecca with his family to meditate during Ramadan, saw the angel Jibra'il appear before him and received the first revelation. The accompanying text is as follows. Jibra'il said, "O Muhammad, you are the messenger of God." "My fear," says Muhammad, "grew so intense that I was about to throw myself off the mountain. So he showed himself to me and said, 'I am Jibra'il, and you are the messenger of God.' And he said, 'Read, in the name of your Lord, who created man from a clot of congealed blood. Later, the text has Muhammad saying, "I looked up and I saw an angel between heaven and earth, so I became frightened." This image, quite small, fills a square in the middle of the page and is deliberately reduced to the essentials described in the text. First, the mountainous landscape with a towering peak framing Muhammad on each side. Then the Prophet himself, traumatized, eyes downcast, clasping his knees and rigid with fear. And finally, the colossal figure of the archangel, so huge that the frame cannot contain his crown, his foot, or his wing. His finger points directly at Muhammad. The contour lines of the hills reflect the impact of Chinese landscape painting, but also correlate with the drapery folds of both figures. The empty space that surrounds those two figures has a power of its own. It resonates with the archangel's words. It also forces the viewer to focus on the interaction between man and spirit. There is nothing else worthy of attention. Muhammad himself is the picture of humble submission to the divine command. Once again, the source appears to be Byzantine, and specifically the even further whittled down version of the Annunciation to the Virgin Mary, popular in mid-Byzantine art, as at the Church of Daphne, where the empty golden space between the two figures serves as a kind of echo chamber within which the divine message resounds. The emotional intensity of this encounter between Muhammad and Jibril is not easily forgotten. Finally, the fourth image concerns the Mi'raj, Muhammad's ascension to heaven. As such, its natural parallel is the ascension of Christ, which also traditionally involved angels. But it illustrates a very different and completely Muslim narrative. The presence of Buraq, the human-headed quadruped that serves as a mount for the Prophet, owes nothing to any Christian tradition and is firmly located within Islamic hagiography. This image appears to be the earliest rendering of this complex and multi-layered scene, replete with elaborate symbolism, but also firmly embedded in earlier pre-Islamic, classical and Near Eastern cultures stretching back to remote antiquity. One may recognize here a certain iconographic overload. The artist wants to say rather more than the painting can comfortably accommodate. There are hints here of the Egyptian Sphinx, the Assyrian Lamassu, a human-headed hybrid lion-bull, and both the centaur of Greek myth and the Sagittarius of classical star lore. All these elements compete with each other for attention. So there's simply too much to take in. Too much detail obscures the core message. These various strands are far from fully integrated into a coherent image, and later Islamic painting ruthlessly pruned several of them. It got rid of the landscape, the Prophet's cowl, the tale of Buraq, the book that Buraq holds, presumably the Quran, the rainbow, the angel offering Muhammad a beverage, and the other angel, apparently and comically, wearing a door on its back. But while these abundant details run the risk of cluttering the image as a whole, They are clear evidence of a desire to make this painting tell a very detailed story of deep spiritual significance. It is their uneasy coexistence that reveals an iconography in the process of creation. To cite a single example, in the text, Muhammad is offered not a single beverage, as in this picture, but a choice between water, milk, and wine. He chooses milk and is told he has made the right decision. But apart from this misunderstood detail and the account of Buraq, this painting does not reflect the content of the text. The intention is clear enough, but the execution leaves much to be desired. Time to conclude. Given the magnitude of the challenge that faced the artists charged with devising a pictorial life of Muhammad, despite the lack of Islamic models, and investing those images with spirituality, they did score some notable successes. It was precisely those Edinburgh images that did carry spiritual weight that were repeated and reworked by later artists, namely the birth of Muhammad, the first revelation, and the Miraj. But remembering the topics raised today at our workshop, let me leave you with a relevant thought. Pictures can be literal, but they can do much, much more than illustrate a text. They march to the beat of a very different drum. They can widen the context, impact, and meaning of a text. They can proclaim unforgettably a different kind of truth. They can embroider it and intensify meaning by introducing emotion and, as I hope I've shown, spirituality. Thank you.